The kingdom was a place unlike any other, a jewel in the heart of the land, where prosperity was not just measured in gold or grain but in the laughter of children, the hum of markets, and the peace that dwelled in the hearts of the people. At its center stood a queen whose reign was spoken of with reverence far beyond the walls of her palace. She was not only the bearer of the crown but also the guardian of balance, the one whose voice carried wisdom and whose heart carried compassion. Her throne, carved from ancient stone and adorned with golden threads, was not a symbol of dominance but of service. From dawn to dusk, she sought the well-being of her people, and in return, their loyalty to her was unshakable. Her subjects saw in her not just a ruler but a mother who nurtured their land with care and diligence. Every season under her reign felt like a blessing. When spring arrived, the farmers tilled the fields knowing their harvest would be fairly taxed, with enough left to feed their families and trade for their needs. In the heat of summer, the markets flourished with colorful cloth, spices and fruits, and travelers from distant lands came to marvel at the richness of her realm. Autumn brought festivals filled with song and dance, rituals of gratitude where the queen herself would walk among her people, sharing food and laughter with them. Even in winter, when cold winds swept through the valleys, no family was left to starve or freeze, for she had long established granaries and shelters to protect the vulnerable. Her reign was not marked by fear of punishment but by the certainty of fairness and compassion, which were rarer and more powerful than any weapon of war. The queen had an uncanny ability to resolve disputes with justice so sharp yet so gentle that both sides often left her presence feeling heard, respected, and whole. When two brothers once quarreled over inherited land, she listened patiently to each claim, then devised a solution that neither had imagined but both found satisfying. When merchants tried to inflate prices to exploit the poor during famine years, she intervened personally, setting limits and ensuring equitable trade. She embodied a balance between firmness and grace, never blinded by wealth, never swayed by flattery. The people trusted her because they knew she would stand against corruption, even if it came from within her court. Her word was law, but it was not wielded as a whip, it was extended as a shield. Her virtues were countless, and they were not only whispered within the kingdom but echoed far beyond its borders. Other rulers sent emissaries to study her governance, hoping to learn her secrets, though most returned convinced that her greatest power lay not in strategies or laws but in the sincerity of her heart. This sincerity was what made her irreplaceable. She remembered the names of commoners, the stories of widows, the hardships of farmers, and the bravery of soldiers. She honored musicians and storytellers, ensuring that art was never silenced even in times of difficulty. She revered the wisdom of elders and encouraged the curiosity of children. Her reign was not one of towering monuments or grand conquests but of living bonds, delicate yet enduring, between crown and subject. But as her people flourished under her care, envy began to creep into the shadows of the palace. Courtiers who longed for influence whispered in hidden corridors. Rival nobles, unused to a throne that placed commoners above their schemes, began to grumble. They could not fathom why the queen was so adored, why her decisions, however modest, carried the weight of destiny itself. To them, her virtues were an obstacle. To her people, they were the kingdom's lifeblood. The envy burned quietly at first, masked by false smiles and practiced bows, but like embers hidden beneath ash, it threatened to ignite into something more dangerous. The queen, in her wisdom, sensed this envy, yet she did not let it harden her spirit. She believed even the envious could be redeemed, that they too could find their place in a kingdom built on fairness. She extended kindness even to those she suspected of harboring resentment, hoping her generosity would soften their bitterness. This, however, only deepened the jealousy in their hearts. They mistook her kindness for weakness and her patience for naivety. But what they failed to understand was that the people's devotion was her greatest fortress, stronger than stone walls or armored guards. For in the hearts of the villagers, farmers, merchants, and craftsmen, the queen was not just a ruler but the very soul of the land. They could not imagine another on the throne, for no one else had proven capable of carrying the kingdom with the same love and wisdom. To replace her would be like tearing out the roots of an ancient tree that gave them shade and fruit. Even those who feared her sternest judgments loved her still, because they knew her hand never struck without reason and her crown never gleamed at their expense. She had become, in their eyes, irreplaceable not because of her title but because of her humanity. Thus, her reign shone like the midday sun, impossible to dim, though clouds of envy gathered slowly in the horizon. The courtiers and rivals might plot in whispers, but the land itself seemed to bow to her presence, blooming under her guidance, thriving under her care. And though envy simmered in secret corners, the truth remained unshakable. She was not just their queen, she was their hope, their heart, and their future. To try and replace her would not only wound the throne but the very soul of the kingdom itself. Whispers began to slither through the palace corridors like snakes in tall grass, their venom hidden but potent. At first, it was nothing more than quiet murmurs exchanged in shadowed corners. A nobleman leaning closer to another at the feast, a lady pretending to adjust her jewelry as she spoke in hushed tones, the lowering of eyes when the queen's name passed their lips. The queen's reign, though prosperous, had made them restless. Her strength was not theirs, her wisdom not theirs to shape, and her popularity overshadowed every attempt at their own advancement. For men and women who thrived on manipulation and influence, the queen's unshakable authority was an unbearable weight pressing them down. They began to look at one another with understanding, as though their silent envy had bound them together. The seeds of betrayal were first planted in the minds of those who thought themselves closest to power yet farthest from control. A duke whose wealth had tripled under the queen's rule could not stand that his fortune was credited to her fair policies rather than his own cunning. A lady of high rank, famed for her sharp tongue, resented that her words held little sway when the queen's gentle speech could calm a restless crowd in moments. Even the royal advisor, a man who once praised her brilliance, began to imagine what life would be like if he were not forever in her shadow. Their envy was not born from suffering but from hunger, the endless, gnawing hunger for more. In secret they gathered. At first, their meetings were dressed as social affairs, wine, music, laughter echoing faintly from hidden chambers. But beneath the surface of merriment, venom was distilled. They spoke of the queen's successes not with admiration but with disdain. "She shines too brightly," one whispered, "and the rest of us are made to look like shadows." Another sneered, "Her kindness weakens the throne. We need someone who can be bent to our will." The words became sharper, their voices bolder, until a dangerous consensus formed: the queen must be replaced. But they were not fools. They knew her popularity with the people ran too deep for a direct strike. No blade in the night, no sudden disappearance, could silence the echoes of her name in the hearts of her subjects. Instead they plotted something subtler, more insidious. If they could convince the people that her reign had lost its favor, that her decisions were misguided or her strength failing, then the throne could be taken from her without drawing the sword. They would craft illusions, whispers disguised as truth, until the very pillars of her reputation began to tremble. The nobles dreamed of a puppet, someone with the crown but without the will. A new ruler whose strings they could pull, whose ears bent easily to their poison. In their minds, they had already chosen candidates: a distant cousin of royal blood, weak in character and hungry for acceptance; a charming nobleman who thirsted for titles more than justice. They whispered these names as though they were already engraved in the annals of history. "The queen has ruled long enough," they hissed. "It is time for change." Yet even in their scheming, they underestimated the bond between queen and people. They mistook her gentleness for fragility, her patience for naivety. They believed that because they could manipulate each other with lies and promises, the people too would be easily swayed. They could not understand that the queen's strength was rooted not in fear, but in love and respect. To them, power was a game of masks and daggers, and they thought themselves the masters of it. Still they pressed forward. They spread rumors in marketplaces, carried subtle insults into taverns, and let carefully crafted doubts take root in conversations among commoners. The queen's enemies wove their web slowly, with patience sharpened by ambition. Each whisper was a thread, each lie another knot in the trap they believed would ensnare her. And in the darkness of their chambers they smiled. They imagined the throne stripped of its true queen, reshaped into a seat they could occupy by proxy. They envisioned gold flowing freely into their hands, laws bent to serve their whims, and the people's loyalty redirected toward a ruler too pliant to resist them. The seeds of betrayal had been sown deep into the soil of the court, watered by greed and nurtured by envy. All that was left was for the first shoots of treachery to rise into the open air, where they could bloom into the downfall of the queen. The day the pretender was brought forward, the air in the kingdom shifted, as if the winds themselves carried whispers of change. The nobles, their hearts heavy with envy and ambition, had been working tirelessly in the shadows to craft their plan. Now they unveiled it with theatrical grandeur, parading the chosen figure before the court and people. The young newcomer was striking, with a charm that seemed carefully polished rather than naturally worn. Their smile was practiced, their gestures rehearsed, and though they spoke with confidence, their words lacked the weight of lived truth. Still, the courtiers praised them with unrelenting enthusiasm, voices echoing through the marble halls as though they were announcing the dawn of a golden age. The throne room was filled with forced celebration. Nobles clapped, ladies-in-waiting bowed, and advisors bent the knee with exaggerated devotion. Each act was less about genuine loyalty and more about ensuring they were seen in alignment with this new figure who, they believed, would be pliable to their will. Their eyes glimmered not with admiration for the supposed heir but with hunger for the power they could siphon once the crown rested on an untested head. They believed they had finally found someone they could mold, someone who would obey rather than rule. Among the common folk, however, unease spread like ripples in a pond. Marketplaces, once filled with laughter and chatter, now carried low murmurs. "Who is this person?" whispered one woman as she bartered for grain. "They have no history here. No battles fought, no harvests shared. How can they sit upon our throne?" an old man muttered, shaking his head as he polished his tools. The queen's people were not blind. They had lived under her steady hand, had seen her fairness in judgment, her compassion in famine, her wisdom in conflict. To them, this replacement felt like a shadow pretending to be sunlight. Still, the courtiers pressed forward with their play, hosting banquets and ceremonies to glorify the pretender. Silk banners bearing new symbols were hung beside the queen's crest, as though to subtly erase her legacy. Musicians sang praises of the newcomer's beauty, while poets invented tales of non-existent victories to make them appear heroic. Even the palace guards, though loyal to the queen, were pressured to treat the pretender with reverence. Yet beneath the surface the atmosphere was strained, like a string pulled too tight, ready to snap at the slightest tug. The queen herself, for a time, remained unaware of the depth of this plot. She was occupied with matters of the realm, negotiating trade agreements, settling disputes among distant villages, and ensuring food supplies reached those in need. Her attention was upon her people, not the schemes festering in the corners of her court. When the pretender was first presented in her presence, she regarded them with a polite smile, unaware of the venom that lingered in the motives of those who surrounded her. She thought little of the young figure, dismissing them as another noble's child presented for attention, as so often happened in courts full of vanity. But even in her momentary dismissal, there were flickers of intuition. The queen noticed how certain advisors seemed too eager to place the pretender near her, how they encouraged her to share duties or decisions with them. She noticed the sudden change in tone among courtiers who once sought only her approval but now divided their flattery between her and this stranger. And she could not ignore the way the common folks' eyes carried questions whenever they approached her, questions they dared not ask aloud, but which weighed upon their hearts nonetheless. The pretender, for all their rehearsed charm, felt the unease too. Though they smiled and performed as instructed, there were moments when their masks slipped. Their gaze hardened, revealing ambition that burned beyond the role of puppet. They began to crave the throne for themselves, no longer content with being a figure controlled by the nobles. This subtle shift did not escape the eyes of the schemers, but they dismissed it, blinded by their confidence that they could always maintain control. They believed the throne was theirs in all but name, forgetting that a throne has a will of its own, tied to the spirit of the land and the heart of its true ruler. Whispers traveled through the kingdom, louder with each passing day. Rumors of betrayal, of strange ceremonies in the palace, of the queen being slowly replaced, carried on the wind. The people's unease hardened into quiet defiance, though they remained patient, waiting for the queen to see the truth for herself. They knew she was not one to act hastily, but when she did act, it would be with wisdom and force no pretender could hope to withstand. The throne itself, ancient and bound by tradition and unseen power, seemed to echo this truth. Servants swore they heard its stones groan at night, as if rejecting the idea of a false ruler. Some said they felt a coldness in the hall whenever the pretender sat near it, as though the throne recoiled from their presence. And though no one dared speak it openly, more and more people began to believe the throne would never accept anyone who tried to take the queen's place. The stage was set. The courtiers, blinded by ambition, had unveiled their pretender. The people, uneasy but patient, placed their faith in their queen. And the queen herself, though still piecing together the depth of betrayal, stood unknowingly at the threshold of a test that would decide not only her reign but the very soul of her kingdom. The first attempts to seat the pretender upon the throne were meant to be grand and ceremonial, a show of stability and power to the people. Yet, what was supposed to be a display of seamless succession instead turned into something unsettling. When the young figure, draped in fine robes and guided by smiling courtiers, approached the ancient throne, the air in the hall shifted. A strange hush spread among the gathered nobles and servants, as if the palace itself was holding its breath. The pretender raised a hand, feigning confidence, and stepped forward. But the throne, carved from ancient stone said to have been blessed by the spirits of rulers past, gave off a faint hum. As the figure tried to sit, the surface seemed to ripple and shift, and the pretender stumbled back as if pushed by an unseen force. Gasps filled the room, and though the courtiers laughed nervously and tried to brush it off, everyone who witnessed it knew something was wrong. That night, when the pretender attempted to retire into the queen's old chambers, the heavy wooden doors refused to yield. Guards pushed and pulled, but the locks would not turn. Finally, with great force, the door creaked open, only to slam shut again before the pretender could step inside. The palace attendants whispered in corners, their voices trembling. Some claimed the very walls had eyes, and that the spirit of the kingdom was rebelling against the deception unfolding within its walls. Candles in the corridors flickered wildly whenever the pretender passed, sometimes extinguishing altogether, leaving hallways in sudden darkness. What should have been a homecoming for a supposed new ruler turned into nights of dread. Objects began to misbehave. The golden scepter, symbol of authority, slipped from the pretender's grasp each time it was raised high. Scrolls and maps flew from tables when the pretender entered the council chamber, scattering across the floor as though refusing to aid this false sovereign. Servants tasked with preparing feasts reported hearing whispers in the kitchens, low voices repeating the queen's name, urging loyalty to her and not to the impostor. Some swore they saw shadows in the corner of their eyes, shaped like the queen's silhouette, watching silently as if reminding them of where their true allegiance lay. The common people began to sense the strangeness as well. When the pretender rode through the city streets, horses grew restless and refused to pull the carriage. Market stalls seemed to collapse just as the figure passed by, baskets of fruit spilling into the dirt. Children, normally eager to run after royal processions, hid behind their mothers' skirts, crying out that the spirit of the queen was angry. Priests and seers were summoned to cleanse the palace, but their incantations dissolved into silence, their charms broken before they could even be laid down. One elder priest, trembling, declared that it was not a curse at work, but the land itself rejecting the pretender. Within the palace, tension grew unbearable. The nobles who had orchestrated the plan laughed louder and demanded that everyone ignore the signs, but their eyes betrayed unease. Late at night, in the banquet hall, goblets tipped over without being touched, spilling wine across the table like blood. Tapestries that once depicted glorious battles and victories seemed to fade, the threads fraying where the queen's likeness was embroidered. Every corner of the palace echoed with resistance, a defiance that words could not erase. The courtiers tried again and again to force the pretender into the throne, hoping repetition would wear down the strange phenomena. Yet each attempt was more humiliating than the last. Once, as the figure's body touched the throne, a chill spread through the hall so deep that the braziers of fire turned to ash. Another time, the very seat seemed to shake violently, nearly tossing the pretender forward into the crowd. People began to murmur that the throne itself had turned its back, refusing to acknowledge the intruder. By now, whispers of rebellion reached the streets. The people's unease grew into certainty. They believed the queen had not truly been replaced, that her bond with the throne and the kingdom was stronger than the plots of power-hungry nobles. Merchants refused to honor royal decrees signed by the pretender's hand. Farmers claimed their fields wilted whenever the false sovereign's name was spoken in rituals of blessing. Even the rivers that ran through the city turned murky, as if nature itself recoiled from the pretense of rule. The queen, still outside the circle of betrayal, began hearing fragments of these rumors. Servants loyal to her carried whispers of doors that locked themselves and a throne that refused to accept another's weight. Slowly, she began to understand that something deeper was at play, something that tied her not only to her people but to the spirit of the land itself. The courtiers had thought they could replace her, but the throne, the palace, and the very kingdom stood as silent guardians, declaring in every flicker of light and every shifting shadow that their queen could not be erased. The whispers began quietly, drifting through the corridors of the palace like shadows that refused to vanish even under the brightest light. At first, the queen dismissed them as mere courtly chatter, for she had long grown accustomed to envy in the hearts of those who stood around her throne. Power, after all, was a flame that drew both devotion and danger. Yet these whispers persisted, not the idle musings of bored courtiers but calculated tones of secrecy. And soon they reached her ears not as rumor but as warning. Her most loyal attendants, those who had served her with honesty since her ascension, began to approach her in quiet moments. One by one they revealed fragments of a larger design. A knight who had sworn his sword to her confessed that he had overheard nobles plotting by torchlight. A maid, trembling, admitted she had been ordered to deliver sealed letters to an unfamiliar figure who carried himself with the arrogance of someone promised power. And an aged scribe, his eyes heavy with sorrow, placed before her records of forged decrees, already stamped with a counterfeit seal meant to mimic her own. The queen listened, not with outrage, but with the calm gravity that had always set her apart. She was not one to leap blindly at every shadow, nor to wield fury as her first weapon. Instead, she gathered these truths with patience, allowing the pieces to form a clearer picture. And as they did, she began to notice what had always been there, waiting for her to see. The throne itself had resisted. Each time the pretender, a figure molded by the courtiers to replace her, approached, the hall grew restless. The golden doors to the chamber refused to swing open at the herald's command. Tapestries fluttered though no wind entered. Torches dimmed, casting uneasy half-light over the throne's seat. Once, when the pretender lowered themselves into the chair of rulership, the stone beneath groaned as if in protest, and the very crown, resting on its velvet cushion, trembled enough to fall to the ground. The courtiers had called it coincidence. But the queen knew better. Her kingdom was alive. Not in the way one sees in roots and rivers, but in the quiet bond between ruler and realm. She had given herself wholly to its people, nurturing its lands, protecting its spirit. And in return, it had bound itself to her, unwilling to accept another in her place. This resistance was no accident. It was a warning, whispered not by mouths of men but by the soul of the kingdom itself. That night, she walked the halls alone, her robes trailing softly across the marble floors. Each step echoed like a heartbeat, steady and sure. She paused at the throne room, placing her hand upon the great doors. They opened for her effortlessly, no struggle, no hesitation. Inside, moonlight streamed through the stained-glass windows, bathing the throne in pale silver. She approached it slowly, lowering herself onto the seat. At once, the chamber grew calm. The flickering torches stilled, their flames straight and steady. The air itself seemed to sigh in relief. The queen closed her eyes, allowing the silence to envelop her. And in that silence, she felt the truth settle deep within her chest. The kingdom would not abandon her, no matter what plots men devised. She was its chosen, its rightful sovereign, and nothing, no pretender, no forged decree, no jealous rival, could sever that bond. Still, she knew wisdom lay not in comfort but in preparation. Betrayal had already taken root among her courtiers. To ignore it would be to give it strength. To confront it recklessly would be to risk everything she had built. Strategy, patience, and resolve would be her allies now. She summoned her most trusted aides, not to declare war but to weave a careful plan. They gathered in secret chambers by candlelight, their faces tense but determined. Maps were unfurled, letters intercepted, allegiances weighed. Every name whispered in the conspiracy was recorded, every loyal heart quietly marked. The queen spoke little, but when she did, her words cut with clarity. Power without honor is nothing but sand. They build their schemes on emptiness, but we will answer with truth and strength. We will not strike in anger but in justice. And when we do, it will be undeniable. Her aides bowed their heads, inspired not by the fire of vengeance but by the calm certainty of her rule. They saw in her eyes what the people always had, not fear, not doubt, but a courage rooted in wisdom. By dawn, the queen rose from her council with a steady resolve. The betrayal had revealed itself, and the throne had spoken. Now she would face her enemies not as a ruler desperate to cling to power, but as the sovereign her people already believed her to be, the one chosen not merely by crown or title but by the kingdom itself. The queen had discovered the truth. And discovery was only the beginning. The day of the confrontation arrived like a storm the court had long anticipated. Whispers had spread through the palace corridors, rippling outward into the streets. The queen was to be removed, her reign declared finished. Nobles and courtiers, dressed in elaborate silks and dripping with false confidence, assembled in the grand hall. Their faces carried masks of self-righteousness, yet behind their eyes gleamed greed, desperation, and envy. They believed they had trapped the queen within the web of their schemes, ready to humiliate her before her people and crown the pretender in her stead. The queen entered the hall with quiet dignity. No crown rested upon her head, no guards trailed at her side, yet she seemed to command the space simply by her presence. The courtiers expected fear or indignation, but she walked with the serenity of someone who had already glimpsed truth. Every step she took echoed through the chamber, measured and calm, as if time itself slowed to watch. The people gathered along the walls, their faces uncertain, caught between loyalty to their sovereign and the pressure of powerful nobles whispering treason into their ears. At the center of the hall stood the throne, elevated upon its carved dais. It gleamed under shafts of sunlight from the high windows, yet the air around it felt strange, charged, almost alive. Those closest to it shifted uneasily, as though the very seat of power was breathing, waiting. A leading courtier, bold with arrogance, raised his voice. "Your Majesty, the time has come for you to relinquish the throne. For the good of the kingdom you must step aside. The new sovereign is chosen and ready." His words rolled across the chamber, but behind the smooth delivery trembled the hope that the queen might falter. The queen said nothing at first. She let the silence stretch, allowing her gaze to pass over each face, the smug ones, the fearful ones, the conflicted ones. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, calm as a river before it deepens into the sea. "If the throne itself wills it, then let it be so." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The nobles had expected denial or outrage, not this serene challenge. The pretender, clad in regal garments far too heavy for their untested shoulders, stepped forward hesitantly. Courtiers flanked them, offering smiles that were too wide, too polished. Together they guided the pretender toward the throne. As the figure approached, the atmosphere shifted. The polished floorboards creaked though no weight had yet touched them. The candles flickered violently, and the sunlight dimmed as though clouds swept across the sky outside. The pretender placed a hand on the throne's armrest, only for the massive seat to groan, shudder, and twist away. Before all eyes, the throne turned, its back facing the pretender. Cries of astonishment rang out. Some nobles fell to their knees in terror, while others shouted accusations, calling the queen a witch, a manipulator. Yet the people saw clearly, the throne itself rejected the usurper. The courtiers tried again. They pulled the throne back into place, steadying it as though it were an unruly beast. With trembling hands, the pretender lowered themselves upon it. But the moment their body touched the seat, the throne tipped forward violently, casting them onto the marble floor with a resounding crash. Gasps turned into murmurs. This was no trick. No mortal hand had done it. The kingdom itself was speaking. The queen stepped closer now, and as she approached, the throne stilled. It straightened on its dais, its carved arms glimmering faintly as though polished by unseen hands. It faced her fully, waiting. When she reached the steps, the throne bowed, not with movement of hinges, but with an almost imperceptible tilt, like a loyal beast recognizing its true master. The crowd erupted into cries, some of awe, some of fear. The nobles panicked, their carefully laid schemes unraveling before their eyes. "This is sorcery," one screamed. "An illusion," shouted another. But the people, once doubtful, began to murmur her name in reverence. They had seen with their own eyes where loyalty truly lay. The queen did not sit. She rested her hand lightly on the throne, acknowledging its gesture, but remained standing. Her calm gaze swept the chamber once more. "The throne is not mine by command of men, but by the bond between ruler and realm. You cannot take what was never yours to give." Her words hung in the air like thunder after lightning. The courtiers stood exposed, trembling beneath the weight of the people's eyes and the throne's unyielding defiance. The first confrontation had ended not with swords or proclamations, but with a living symbol declaring its truth before all. And in that moment the queen's reign grew stronger than ever, for it was no longer secured only by law or lineage, it was upheld by the will of the kingdom itself. The moment the pretender was guided once more toward the throne, a heavy silence gripped the palace. Every eye was fixed upon the gilded seat, its high back gleaming with ancient carvings that carried the weight of generations. The courtiers, growing desperate, urged the figure forward, whispering words of flattery and assurance. Yet the atmosphere itself had shifted. The air felt dense as if the very stones of the hall were holding their breath. When the pretender raised their hand to touch the throne, the seat shuddered violently. A deep rumble echoed through the chamber, reverberating like a warning from the bones of the palace. The crowd gasped. Some stepped back in fear, clutching their garments as the marble beneath their feet trembled faintly. But the courtiers pushed harder, commanding the pretender to sit, insisting this was only a test of strength. The moment the figure lowered onto the throne, the seat seemed to recoil. The carved lions at its arms twisted, their eyes glowing with a faint, eerie light. With a sudden jerk, the throne slid back a full pace, nearly unseating the pretender. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some whispered that the throne had moved on its own, while others crossed themselves with charms, terrified that the seat had come alive. The courtiers tried again, steadying the pretender, their faces taut with strain. But when the figure attempted to rest fully against the high back of the throne, the great seat tilted forward, throwing them off balance. The pretender stumbled, sprawling at the foot of the dais. The sound of laughter erupted, not from the people but from the throne itself. A low, hollow creak echoed like mocking amusement, making the entire hall quake with unease. At that instant, the palace joined in its judgment. The great chandeliers flickered wildly, their flames sputtering and sparking until shadows stretched like grasping hands across the walls. The tall doors that had once opened to welcome the queen now slammed shut with a deafening crash, sealing the hall like a courtroom where justice would be served. The courtiers' voices faltered, their confidence crumbling. The pretender, pale and shaken, tried one last time to ascend. But the throne had already decided. As they neared, the golden seat glowed faintly, then grew hot to the touch. Smoke hissed from its carvings, forcing the pretender to recoil in pain. The scent of burning fabric lingered in the air. A collective gasp swept through the assembly. It became clear to all, the throne itself rejected the false sovereign. No matter the courtiers' schemes, no matter the pretender's charm, the ancient seat of power refused to yield. The people, who had stood uncertain at the edges of the chamber, now whispered fervently, their voices rising into chants that favored the rightful queen. Or replaced their doubts. Fear gave way to conviction. As the pretender collapsed in humiliation at the steps of the dais, the throne shifted once more, but this time it turned slightly, its carved back facing the queen's direction. The message was undeniable, the kingdom's heart still belonged to her. The queen rose slowly, her presence commanding without effort. She did not gloat, nor did she raise her voice. Her calm eyes swept across the trembling courtiers, then settled upon the throne that had defended her so fiercely. The people's voices swelled into cheers, echoing off the vaulted ceilings. The palace itself seemed to breathe easier, its walls no longer groaning with resistance. The judgment had been delivered. The usurper's plans lay in ruin, and the queen's bond with her throne, unshaken, eternal, had been proven before all. The palace had finally fallen silent after days of turmoil. Whispers still stirred in the marble halls, but they carried no venom now, only awe, relief and shame. The throne had spoken, and its judgment had shaken even the boldest of traitors. Those who had plotted the queen's downfall now cowered like children caught beneath the gaze of an unyielding parent. The grand seat of power had rejected their chosen pretender in full view of the kingdom, and there was no hiding from the truth anymore. The queen, however, did not stride into this moment with vengeance in her heart. She stood upon the dais, regal and calm, her presence a striking contrast to the chaos that had preceded it. Her crown shimmered faintly in the torchlight, and the air around her seemed to hum with a quiet authority. She had been betrayed, tested, nearly usurped, but she was still queen. And she intended to show her people what true strength meant. Her gaze swept across the courtiers assembled in the hall. Some bowed their heads, unable to meet her eyes. Others trembled, still shaken from the throne's rejection of the pretender. Yet the queen's expression was not one of anger. Instead, it carried the weight of disappointment, as though she were gazing not at traitors, but at children who had forgotten their duty. "You who sit before me," she began, her voice steady and resonant, "thought loyalty could be traded for silver, for whispers of power, for promises made in shadowed corridors. You forgot the oath you swore, not to me but to the kingdom itself." A hush fell over the hall. Even the faintest rustle of garments ceased. "You saw the throne resist you," she continued, her tone sharpening. "You saw doors refuse to open, lights falter and walls shiver. The kingdom spoke and it did not recognize your greed. Do you understand now? Power is not stolen. It is not bought. It is given, by the land, by the people, by the spirit of the realm itself." She let the words hang in the air, piercing each soul in the chamber. And then, as many expected her to demand blood, she did something few anticipated. "I will not see this hall turned into a place of executions," she declared. "I will not stain these floors with vengeance. Betrayal has already brought enough darkness into these walls. But know this, mercy is not weakness. It is strength, and it demands more from you than punishment ever could." Gasps rippled through the courtiers. Some fell to their knees, weeping in relief. Others bowed deeply, their faces pressed to the ground, shamed by her mercy even more than they would have been by her wrath. The queen raised her hand and silence once more returned. "Let this be your warning," she said. "The kingdom has shown you that greed leads only to ruin. If ever again you place ambition above duty, if ever you conspire against the rightful order of this land, it will not be I who cast judgment, it will be the throne, the palace, the kingdom itself. And its verdict will be final." The crowd shuddered, remembering the throne's terrifying refusal of the pretender. Her words carried not only authority but truth, for they had witnessed it with their own eyes. Then she turned her gaze toward the common people gathered beyond the courtiers. Farmers, artisans and servants had come to watch, uncertain of what fate awaited their queen. To them she offered a different tone, softer yet still firm. "You have seen what loyalty means," she told them. "Not blind obedience but faithfulness to justice, to truth, to the land that sustains us. The kingdom chose me not because of my crown, but because of the bond we share. I do not rule for myself, I rule for you. Remember this and stand firm in it, even when those in fine robes forget." A murmur of approval rose among the people, low but swelling like the tide. The courtiers looked on, realizing that the queen's true strength did not lie in her guards or her crown, but in the loyalty of the kingdom's heart. At last the queen lifted her hand once more. "Rise," she commanded. "Serve not me but the realm. Let this betrayal be a lesson written into your bones. Let it remind you that power rooted in greed crumbles, but power rooted in justice endures forever." And with that she turned and took her seat upon the throne. This time the great seat did not resist. Instead it welcomed her, glowing faintly as though acknowledging not only her authority, but the mercy and wisdom she had shown. The hall filled with reverent silence, for all understood they were in the presence of a ruler not only chosen by blood or tradition, but by the very spirit of the kingdom itself. The years that followed the queen's restoration did not pass in silence. They grew into seasons of harvest and peace, of storms endured and overcome, and of a people who remembered what they had witnessed with eyes that could never again be deceived. What happened in the palace that day, the throne tilting against the pretenders, the walls echoing the will of justice, and the queen's calm refusal of vengeance, became the seed of a tale that would outlive all who first told it. The courtiers who once sought her downfall lived on, but not as they had before. Humbled by the public shame of their failure, they walked with bowed heads through the streets where once they had strutted proudly. The people did not throw stones at them, nor did the queen strip them of all possessions. Instead they lived as living reminders of folly. Mothers would tug their children's sleeves when these men passed by and whisper, "Look, there go the ones who tried to trade loyalty for gold. Do not follow their path." In this way their punishment was not through chains or gallows but through memory itself. The queen ruled with an even steadier hand after those events. She had seen with her own eyes the frailty of ambition and the cost of betrayal, but also the resilience of loyalty and the deep truth that authority, when bound to justice, could never truly be stolen. Her throne was no longer just wood and stone. It had become a living emblem of her reign, a silent companion that bore witness to every decree, every plea and every act of judgment. People swore that when she sat upon it, the air grew lighter, the hall brighter, as if the throne itself breathed with contentment. Travelers carried this story beyond the borders of the kingdom. A merchant from a neighboring land who had stood in the crowd during the failed coup, told it in marketplaces far away. Sailors carried it across the seas, turning it into song. Wanderers told it in deserts under the stars, their voices low and reverent. And so the legend of the living throne spread, until it became less about a single queen and more about the nature of power itself. Generations later, when children asked their elders why a ruler must be both strong and merciful, they were told of the queen who could have destroyed her enemies but instead chose justice tempered with mercy. They were told that it was not fear of the sword that steadied her rule, but the throne's own refusal to carry the weight of deceit. In fireside circles, the story shifted and shimmered like the flame itself. Some said the throne had a soul, carved into it by the hands of ancient ancestors who had blessed it with vigilance. Others swore that it was the spirits of the people themselves, unwilling to let a false ruler rest upon their legacy. But no matter how the tale was told, the heart of it never changed. True authority cannot be seized through trickery, nor held by greed. Power rooted in lies will always crumble, but power rooted in virtue will endure, and even the inanimate will rise in its defense. The queen grew older as all mortals do, but the reverence she commanded only deepened. When her hair turned silver and her steps slowed, the people looked at her not with pity but with awe, for they remembered the strength she had shown when others sought to strip her crown. She became less a ruler and more a living legend in her own time, a figure whose very presence quieted disputes and stilled unrest. In her final years she often sat in the great hall, alone with the throne that had once tilted away from the hands of traitors. She would rest her palm upon its carved arm, tracing the grooves as though in conversation with an old friend. Some attendants whispered that they saw the throne shift subtly under her touch, as if bowing to her even in private. Others said they heard faint echoes when she sat, like voices of past rulers or perhaps of the throne itself, murmuring approval. Whether these were truth or imagination mattered little. For the kingdom believed them, and belief is the foundation of legend. When the queen finally passed, The mourning was unlike any seen before. The people wept not only for the loss of their sovereign but for the closing of an era where they had seen with their own eyes how justice defended itself. The throne was left empty for a time, draped in cloth of mourning, while the people gathered to decide what her death meant for their future. And then came the question that bound their history to their future. Who would succeed her? By now, every child knew the story of the throne's judgment. Every farmer and scholar alike knew that the seat of power was no mere ornament but a guardian. Thus, when it came time to choose the next ruler, no one dared force the decision. Instead, they allowed the throne itself to speak once more. One by one the candidates approached, princes, princesses, noble sons and wise daughters. Some bowed deeply before it, some placed trembling hands upon its arms. Yet when one unworthy tried to sit, the throne did as it had before. It shifted, tilted, and cast the pretender aside. Gasps filled the hall, but none were surprised. Finally, a young woman of humble birth, known for her fairness and compassion, stepped forward. She had not come seeking the throne, but the people urged her to try. When she lowered herself upon its seat, the hall fell into silence. The throne remained still, steady and radiant as though welcoming her weight. In that moment the legend proved itself again. The throne did not bend to bloodline alone, nor to ambition but to virtue. From that day on, the throne became not only the seat of kings and queens but the ultimate arbiter of succession. Never again could greed or deception hope to crown a ruler, for the throne itself would expose them. This became the safeguard of the kingdom's future, and in this safeguard lay the queen's truest legacy. Centuries passed, yet the story never dimmed. It was painted in murals across palace walls, woven into tapestries and carved into the arches of temples. In villages far from the capital, storytellers began their tales with the familiar words, "There was once a queen whose throne knew the difference between truth and deceit." Children sat wide-eyed as they heard of the day the throne turned its back on traitors, and of the queen who forgave but never forgot. Elders ended their tales with warnings, "Greed may raise you high, but justice will always cast you down." In time, the throne itself became a pilgrimage site. Not only rulers but common folk came to see it. They would kneel before it, not to claim power, but to seek its silent blessing. Lovers promised fidelity before its steps. Disputing neighbors placed their cases before it, hoping that its unseen will might guide them to peace. The throne had become more than a seat of power, it was a mirror of conscience, a reminder carved in wood and stone that justice, when true, could never be dethroned. And so the legend of the throne lived on, echoing across generations and borders. Scholars debated whether it had truly moved of its own accord, or whether it was simply the will of the people made manifest. Priests claimed it was the voice of the ancestors. Philosophers argued it was proof that symbols themselves can gain life when enough hearts believe in them. But to the people, such debates mattered little. What mattered was the truth they carried in their hearts. Authority born of greed cannot stand, but authority born of justice cannot fall.